Now, recently, the House Judiciary Committee had a hearing about religious freedom. Okay, well, that's fascinating. I'm curious as to why we need a hearing on religious liberty. Maybe it has something to do with the Hobby Lobby case being decided in the Supreme Court. Now, they're hearing arguments, of course, started probably at the end of last month. So the Judiciary Committee is having this hearing, and one of the speakers happens to be a man named Barry Lynn. Now, he's the executive director for Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. Now, Representative Louie Gohmert is on the House Judiciary Committee, so he was present for this meeting, and he had a question.
I'm curious, in your Christian beliefs, do you believe in sharing the good news that will keep people from going to hell consistent with the Christian beliefs?
Yes, I'm happy to. When I speak to...
Okay, so you don't believe somebody would go to hell if they do not believe Jesus is the way, the truth, the life?
I personally do not believe people go to hell because they don't believe in a specific set of ideas in Christianity.
No, not a set of ideas. Either you believe as a Christian that Jesus is the way, the truth, the life, or you don't. And there's nothing wrong in our country with that. There's no crime. There's no shame. It should never be a law against those beliefs. And that's what we want to maintain is people's chance to elect yes or no.
Congressman, what I believe is not necessarily what I think ought to justify the creation of public policy for everybody, for the 2,000 different religions that exist in this country, the 25 million non-believers. I've never been offended. I've never been afraid to share my belief. When I spoke recently at an American Atheist Conference, it was clear from the very beginning in the first sentence that I was a Christian minister. I was there to talk to them about the preservation of the Constitution. And in fact, I said, you know, we can debate the issue of the existence of God for another 2,000 years. I want to preserve the Constitution and its effect on all people, believers and not believers, in the next 5 years. We could have a very interesting discussion sometime, probably not in a congressional hearing.
Well, I was just trying to figure out when you say Christian.
Scriptural passages.
All right, so this is what Louie Gohmert thinks is important enough to bring up in a congressional hearing. So this isn't anything super egregious on Louie's part. He thinks he's a Christian, and okay, that's fine. But what I really liked about this discussion is what Pastor Lynn had said. What I believe is not necessarily what I think ought to justify the creation of public policy for everybody. And that's that's really the difference here. Now, you have people like Louie Gohmert, Ted Cruz, Michelle Bachmann, and many more like them that do see their beliefs as a justification for making public policy. It's because they don't really believe in the separation of church and state. But take Hobby Lobby for an example. They're a corporation that doesn't want their insurance that they offer to their employees to cover emergency contraceptions, right? Because they feel it violates their religious beliefs. Now, the Washington Post explains. The question these cases are seeking to solve is whether for-profit companies have a right to exercise religious freedom under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, a federal law passed in 1993 that states that the government shall not substantially burden a person's exercise of religion, even if the burden results from a rule of general applicability. So if Hobby Lobby gets a win on the Supreme Court, that would be an example of public policy based on religious belief, something Louie Gohmert would probably definitely agree with. And that brings up another issue that's somewhat related to this, is the idea that corporations are people with First Amendment rights, something a lot of Republicans also agree with. So back to Gohmert and why he's talking about Jesus during a congressional hearing. Now, I said before that he doesn't believe in the separation of church and state. But if you ask him, he might actually say something a little bit different. And for this, I go to a raw story. Now, this was on the separation of church and state as described by Louie Gohmert in a video. He said, quote, but it was to be a one-way wall, where the state would not dictate to a church, but the church would certainly play a role in the state. So that's a little different idea than a lot of people have about the separation of church and state now. So this is what they believe, man, that Christian religion should rule America. They want us to be like Iran, American Sharia law. But instead of Islamic law, it'd be Christian law. So people like Gohmert, personally to me, I think that the people like Gohmert are dangerous and they hold significant power. And I think that's a major problem. What do you guys think about this?
Well, I mean, first of all, in regards to what the pastor said there, the fact he had to refer to him as congressman, like, and give Louie Gohmert any sort of respect is beyond me. And then when Louie said, it's not wrong at all for for this country if you have different religious beliefs and stuff like that. There's nothing wrong with our country having people celebrate different religious beliefs, but the tone of his voice and the manner in which he phrased it is almost like, there's nothing wrong in you kind of in the country allowing that, but there's something wrong with you in believing that. And the very fact that the problem with a lot of the people like Louie Gohmert and those sorts of kind of Christian extremist mindsets is they see separation of church and state, and they see that as there should be a separation so that the state cannot interfere with the church. Like they see it as they imagine it as a one-way system of kind of like being able to block things, and that's not the case. There's no comma in that sentence. It's absolutely ridiculous and egregious things. No, of course he wants to basically start up a Christianity or Christian caliphate in kind of the states that we represent. It's unbelievable. I mean, fair credit to the pastor and just saying, no, it doesn't matter what I believe. My beliefs shouldn't, no one's beliefs at all should influence kind of how policy is formed. Policy should be based on facts. And I give full credit to that pastor for standing, and it doesn't take a lot to stand up to Louie Gohmert and saying, no, you're an idiot, you don't know what you're talking about.
All right, Sean, go ahead.
Oh, and I was going to say, it's basically impossible to have a separation of church and state if it only goes one way. Because if the dominant church can influence government policy, then won't they use that influence to influence over the other churches, the less dominant churches? Like, it doesn't, like, his theory on the separation of church and state is ridiculous. And like, it's nobody's saying that you can't have your beliefs and that can't lead you to a moral foundation, and you can't enact laws based on that moral foundation. But you can't enact laws that promote a specific religion or a specific religious agenda. Like, it's not that hard to figure out, and the relationship is beneficial for both the church and the state. Like, each are, if they're separate institutions, it's not like it's a negative for the church to not be influenced by the government, or it's a negative for the government not to be influenced by the church. It benefits both. It lets our societies function more, like, efficiently, for one thing. Like, it's just, Louie Gohmert is such a fool, and he's actually, I'm glad he's a congressman for one reason, because he used to be a judge, which means he used to rule on cases. So I'm glad he's an irrelevant member of Congress and probably the dumbest member of Congress.
So I want to echo a lot of what's been said and kind of expound on it. Bravo to Reverend Lynn for pointing out, I mean, there's a sad irony here that has to be balanced with the fact that I'm glad to see someone say it, but what we have is a man of the cloth telling the congressman, the United States government official, to stop trying to be a pastor and start being a legislator. And the congressman telling the pastor to stop trying to be a pastor and try to be a legislator. Like, it's ridiculous. And to Sean's point, not only, I mean, Sean points out the obvious logical fallacy in Gohmert's understanding of separation of church and state, but there's also, I mean, the history backs it up. One reason why the separation of church and state was so important in the early days in the founding of our nation was because the crown that we rebelled against, England, had a state church. They still have a state church. And the great irony here is, of the four of us, the Brit in the room is not a member of the Church of England, but I am, by way of the Anglican Church in North America. So that was one reason why the separation of church and state was so important, was because it was, Anglicanism and the church, quote unquote, was associated with the crown that our nation had rebelled against. And so, yeah, there was a history. There a lot of bloodshed in England, from Cromwell all the way up to Elizabeth, over going back and forth between which state the church favored, or which church the state favored, excuse me. And there's a lot of history of whenever you don't have a separation of church and state, the big church running roughshod over the other churches. And that's just within the Christian context. That's not even, talking about a society that's anywhere near as pluralistic as ours is, where so many different people and so many different religions, so many different groups have to be represented and be treated fairly. So yeah, Gohmert's idea is just idiotic. And then one point, I really hate it whenever people have to get on a soapbox anytime a story is remotely related to something. But I have to get on my projection soapbox here, man. Like whenever conservatives get up in arms about Sharia law and people trying to impose theocracy in America, that's because they're trying to do it. That's why they feel so threatened, because it's what they're doing. And they want it to happen, but they want it to be their religion and not somebody else's. And that's just totally what's going on here. And finally, I guess you could say, because of the events of today and how out of hand things have gotten, a congressional hearing on separation of church and state could be something within the right context that maybe the country needs. However, not just a member of the government, but somebody who holds a pretty big position in the government, like Louie Gohmert, asking a pastor about what he believes happens to the unevangelized or people who don't know Jesus, like, that's not the kind of thing that is supposed to happen in the halls of Congress. I had to write a paper about that as a freshman in my Intro to Missions class because I was a Christian Studies major. That's where that conversation happens. That's not something that's supposed to happen in the halls of government. That's not a governmental question. It's not even a really, really important question, theologically speaking. So why are you wasting taxpayers' time doing it, and why are you making it so central to the way you form laws for 300 million people? It's ridiculous, man.
I wanna drop one final point of irony in this story, is that the Constitution says that there could be no religious tests for public office, and Louie Gohmert was I realized that guy was just a witness in the hearing, but Louie Gohmert was asking him basically how Christian you were, as if that is what qualifies you to be in that room. And the one final point is, a hearing necessarily on the separation of church and state is not a bad thing, right? Because it is a part of our law, and certain laws, like the Hobby Lobby case, has a little bit of nuance in it. They're not 100% anti-birth control in theory. They're anti-specific methods. So that, in theory, makes sense. But don't ask questions that seem like you're administering a religious test to the witness, who is a pastor.
My final point to sort of close this out is like I said, people like Gohmert, they are dangerous, and they do hold a significant power. I disagree that he's an irrelevant congressman, because he has a lot of appointments and a lot of really important committees. And the final point to make is that if you want that to change, you have to do something about it. And the thing that you can do, man, is, if you're in Texas, man, get out and vote. There are progressives in Texas. There's liberals in Texas, man. And pretty soon, the demographics are going to change. And if you want to get people like Louie Gohmert out of office, man, go out and vote. Just vote.